Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I will be talking about Season 3, Episode 23, The Right Kind of House, starring Robert Emhart as Mr. Waterbury and Jeanette Nolan as Mrs. Grimes. And this is a really exceptional episode, in my opinion. Certainly one of the best episodes of Season 3, and probably one of the best episodes of the first 3 seasons of Alfred Hitchcock Presents that I have seen. The episode doesn't really do anything new. It's a pretty typical mystery suspense episode, but just about everything it does very, very well. The episode is well acted, fast paced, and exciting, and has a pretty solid twist as well, which I didn't really see coming until the end of the episode, which is always appreciated. So we start with our main character, Mr. Waterbury, and he's driving through a town that he says he's been to before, which is actually pretty significant to the plot. And he goes to see this man, Mr. Hacker. He wants to inquire about a house. Mr. Hacker sells houses. It's also notable that Mr. Hacker has a secretary who I thought was pretty amusing and brought some nice comic relief to the episode. I enjoyed her character. But this house that Mr. Waterbury is interested in, there is a problem with it. Mr. Hacker says this woman named Mrs. Grimes owns it and that she's put it up for a lot more than it's worth. I think she wants to sell it for like $50,000 or something, which I guess was a lot of money for a house at the time that this was made. The problem is the house isn't worth nearly that much. So Mr. Waterbury gets the idea that he's going to visit this lady and maybe he can talk her down, find out more out about the house, things like that. So he does go to greet her, and Mr. Waterbury is pleasant enough. He's pretty friendly, but Mrs. Grimes isn't as friendly. That's a nice way to say it. She seems to be a little bit crabby and suspicious immediately. We'll find out more about that as the episode goes. So they chat, and Mr. Waterbury just is getting to know this lady a little better and talking about, how he likes the house and how he likes the town, things like that. And Mrs. Grimes is very suspicious of why. She asks him, have you been here before? He says he's driven through many times, things like that. These are all significant to the plot, but they feel just like their conversation getting to know someone. I thought it was nice and subtle how they put clues to the ending here without really making them seem like clues, if that makes sense. So Waterbury also says at this point that he's by himself. He doesn't really have a family or anything and nobody to leave the money to. So maybe he'll just pay her high price. So Mrs. Grimes' mood immediately gets more pleasant, which should have told me something was up. But I just thought she was happy to sell the house at this point. So Mrs. Grimes starts telling a story about her son, Michael, who passed away, and we get some flashback scenes. I did think these could have been slightly better. They don't really ruin the episode, but they were okay, I guess. So it turns out that Michael comes home one day. We get to see him with his mother, Mrs. Grimes, and you can tell she cares about him. But he says he lost his job. He also freaks out when Mrs. Grimes takes his bag. We'll find out more about that later. He makes up the excuse that it's because he was fired, but I pretty much figured it was something else at this point. So the chat continues. We see another flashback, and Mrs. Grimes, we get to hear a conversation between Michael and somebody. We don't hear who it was, but it was still a suspenseful, well-done scene. Basically, they're arguing, and it turns out that Michael winds up being a goner. Mrs. Grimes finds him. It turns out that the police come by, and that Michael stole money with a group of other peoples, and one of them, it is assumed, came back to get the money, but Michael says he doesn't have it. So it's now suspected that maybe the money is hidden somewhere in the house, but nobody really knows for sure. And Mrs. Grimes also lies to the police and says she never saw this black bag, even though we know different. So we go back to the present, and Mrs. Grimes and Waterbury are still talking, and it turns out that Mrs. Grimes said the reason she never looked for the money and left the bag there was because she figured that the person who came looking for the money years ago and killed her son would eventually come back and look for it again. And this is also the reason she put the high price on the house, because her reasoning was the only person who would be willing to pay that much was a person who knew there was more money than that in the house because they knew about the bag, which in this case does turn out to be Mr. Waterbury. And I gotta say, this twist was well concealed and I never saw it coming until right before it happened. Now, you could say that this was kind of a big assumption on Mrs. Grimes' part, but I bought it well enough. It worked really well within the episode. Her reasoning makes sense here. And it also turns out that now Waterbury, kind of threatens her in a subtle way, but it turns out he doesn't have time to really do anything because Mrs. Grimes also poisoned his drink. And right at this moment, conveniently, Waterbury falls over and he is also a goner. And then at this point, Mrs. Grimes calls back Mr. Hacker, who we saw at the beginning of the episode, and tells him that her house is still for sale. So, like I said, a very entertaining episode all the way through. It's suspenseful and mysterious and very well acted. And I like all the subtle clues were thrown in without giving away the ending of the episode. I didn't think this was that predictable at all. And this is a great example of an episode which might not have a lot of original ideas, but all the ideas executed are fantastic. Now, I do have one slight complaint about this episode, and that is that I thought that the flashback scenes could have been handled a little bit better. But as it is, The Right Kind of House is still an excellent episode, and I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. And this is an essential Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode, in my opinion, and I recommend everyone that's a fan of the show watch it. So 4.5 out of 5 for The Right Kind of House, and as always, thank you very much for watching.